Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 4th Asia Leadership Forum. My name is Michelle Hawkes, and I'm the founding director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Our mission is to educate about Asia and its diaspora. And one of the most exciting ways we do this is through our Asia Leadership Forum, which invites world leaders from Asia to discuss international topics. This year, when we were deliberating over the ideal person to deliver our keynote address, my colleague, Professor Diane Desierto, who's a global affairs and law professor and an international human rights lawyer, emailed me out of the blue and basically said, I'm representing Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa in front of the Philippine Supreme Court. Would you be interested in bringing her to Notre Dame? So I thought for about 2 seconds, and as you can imagine, my team and I were totally elated, and we are so thankful to Professor Desierto for connecting us to Ms. Ressa. We are also thankful to our co-sponsor, Notre Dame International, and especially Catherine Wilson, who manages visitor protocol and who cleared her schedule to help with this event. As always, we're also thankful to our university president, the Reverend John I. Jenkins, CSC. Notre Dame's 17th president, Father Jenkins, was elected by the Board of Trustees in 2005, and as president, he devotes himself to fostering Notre Dame's unique place in the world. This includes Asia, and the Liu Institute is honored by Father Jenkins' support to expand the study of Asia, especially in establishing the Liu Institute. Thank you, Father John, for being with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank 2 other special guests in the audience today, brother and sister Emily Liu Foy and Justin Liu. As proud graduates of the University of Notre Dame, Emily and Justin inspired their family foundation to invest in Asian studies at Notre Dame by establishing the Liu Institute. Their commitment to ensuring that Notre Dame students and the larger community have the opportunity for meaningful education and experience with Asia has transformed this university. And we would not be at this event today without their vision and generous support. Thank you, Emily and Justin. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to say a few more words about Professor Diane Desierto, who will moderate the Q&A after the lecture. A citizen of the Philippines, Professor Desierto is a member of the United Nations Working Group on the Right to Development. She has successfully litigated at the United Nations Human Rights Committee and at the Philippine Supreme Court. She also will represent Ms. Ressa in front of the Philippine Supreme Court in defense against charges of cyber libel that were leveled in retaliation by a government seeking to silence a voice of truth and accountability. And now, it is my honor to introduce our guest of honor. Maria Ressa was born in a wooden house in Manila in 1963. She grew up in the Philippines and the United States, graduating from Princeton in 1986. Afterwards, she earned a Fulbright to study political theater in the Philippines. It was upon this return that she entered the field of journalism and eventually founded Rappler in 2012. Rappler went on to expose corruption and violence by the regime of former President Rodrigo Duterte, especially his policies on the war on drugs, and abuse by the police. Rappler also exposed manipulative fake news stories that take advantage of social media algorithms to spread lies. This disinformation has consequences for democracy around the world, and Ressa and her work have earned international regard. Time magazine named Ressa the 2018 Person of the Year. And in 2021, the Nobel Committee awarded her the Peace Prize, along with Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov, for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Now, please join me in welcoming Maria Ressa.
Wow. It is so good. I can see you. First of all, thank you for spending your time here, and thank you for having me. Let me start with a dilemma. Since you are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, the leaders today, I want to give you one of the most difficult decisions I've had to make and kind of ask you, which way would you go, right? So this was in 1999, a long time ago. We were in East Timor. East Timor at that point was in the middle of essentially its fight for independence. And the anti-independence or pro-independence, the militia and the Indonesian military were fighting together. And then there were pro-independence activist groups that were fighting against Indonesian rule. We were in the capital, Dili, and we had heard that there was a massacre in Suwai, a church in Suwai. There was a Filipino priest, Father Hilarion, who I knew. And so it was early, it was dawn. My team and I got in the car and we began the drive. About 45 minutes out of the capital in Laetitia, we stopped to get gas. And one of my best sources, he's an activist, pro-independence, came to the car looking really scared. He asked if he could come with us because he said he's being chased. And I had a team. There were 4 of us in the car, right? I had a cameraman, my sound tech, my producer, myself, and then our driver. We were going to Suwai, 4 hours away, where the Indonesian military was. And if I took this man with us in the car, it makes us more of a target. But he literally, I could sense he feared for his life. What would you do? Would you take him or not? Seriously, I'm asking. No, really. Who wants to take a stab? Please. Anton, of course you would. Anton won. What would you do? You would take him.
Yes.
Okay. Who else? Would anyone not take him? You would take him. Predominantly? You would. Okay. So here's what I did. I was the team leader. I worked for CNN. It's 1999. And my task was to get the story. And if we had gotten to Suwai before the massacre, we could actually help prevent some of that violence, right? So what I did was actually told him, you know, I'm sorry, we're going into Indonesian military territory, you know, but we're gonna come back today. Meet me back at this gas station at 8 p.m. and then we can take you back and we can help you get out, get to safety. So of course, we did. We got to Suwai. There was a massacre in Suwai. We got back, drove back through Laetitia, and we waited over an hour and a half for him. And then only 2 weeks later, I find out that he's on the list of missing, presumed dead. I still ask myself whether I made the right call. And as a leader, you will make calls in difficult situations. And some of them you have to make quickly, right? I think I did because my task is to get the news. If my team didn't get to Suwai, the world wouldn't know. We were the only, actually, I was gonna say we were the only American news organization there. I think we were the only news organization there because we're brown, right? They were attacking white or foreign journalists at that point in time. Let me go from that experience, because that is the type of nuanced decisions you make. And when you make these decisions, you live with them for the rest of your life. There was a time, a few years after that, every time I think to that, because I knew him well, it would make me cry, right? But my team knew, and in the end, that's how I justify it. Let me go through some of these things that I hope will be helpful to you, and then define the critical problem we are facing today. Why today is so different from anything I've ever lived through. This is my 37th year as a journalist, and I've never lived through anything like this. This is like living on quicksand. And I can only imagine what your life is like, especially if you're Gen Z, if you're searching for meaning, and you look for it here, where the outrage attention economy tries to keep you scrolling, right? This is what we have done to our incoming, to this incoming generation. So let me move through, right? So this is actually the question. These are some of the questions I looked at in this book. I didn't realize it was already behind me. But the biggest question is that because truth is elusive, the three sentences I've said over and over since 2016, which is when the attacks against us began. If you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these three, we have no shared reality. You can't solve any problem, let alone have a functioning democracy. So the book really asks the question, because I think this is personal to each of us. What are you willing to sacrifice for the truth, right? So let me show you some of the okay. One more time. Yes. So I want to kind of just show you some of the, I guess there are 4 quick lessons that layer. Because every time I had 10 arrest warrants filed against me beginning in 2019, 10, in less than 2 years, and I just kept posting bail. Because what do you do, right? So these were the things that kept, and this is kind of like building identity. It's layer upon layer upon layer. I'm gonna do the micro and then we'll pull out to the problem, right? The first one is, I love that I'm at Notre Dame because there's several things that will resonate to a Catholic. The golden rule was very important, and I learned it very young. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the subtitle is the personal lesson I took out of it. So every chapter had the macro, the subtitle is the micro, make the choice to learn. If ever you're forced to make a decision, don't delay. Figure it out, and then always make the choice to learn. I always used to wind up telling Rappler that if we delay at this moment in time with the information ecosystem the way it is, then we're actually negative. We're in the negative. We have to move, and then if it doesn't work, you have to shift again. The second one I like is this one, draw the line. And you should do it now, while you're still in school. What I mean is draw the line where on this side you're good, this side you're evil. You have to make it that clear because we human beings have a wonderful ability to rationalize everything, right? And it's part of what changes it, but when it is so clear when you're young, then you know when you cross over. And I use this all the time because you have to draw the line first before you can hold the line, right? So these are the values, I think. And I talk about the honor code where I went to a university where I loved this honor code, and it wound up helping every part of my professional life. I don't know if it's the same here, but our professors would give us the exam at the end of every paper. We have to write these one sentence, the pledge. Then they would leave the room. And then we take the exam and then write, I pledge on my honor that I've not violated the honor code. It's a simple sentence. But what I loved about it is that you pledge not only that you haven't cheated, but that if you see anyone else cheating, you would report it. Otherwise, it goes against your honor. And somehow that became a foundation for me. You're in charge of your area, your patch of the world around you, right? I like that also. The speed of trust, be vulnerable. Vulnerability oftentimes is seen as a weakness, but really, at least for me, and you can see, I'm a pretty hardcore journalist. It's actually been a strength because when you have to make quick connections, when people let you into their lives at this horrendous moments, both good and extremely tragic, if you don't lower your shields, you don't make the connection, and that makes a difference in the type of stories you get. So I've learned that being vulnerable is actually a strength. Because I'm Filipino American, let's talk relationship. We always used to say, Americans tend to think an oak tree. I'm going to compare two types of plants, right? The oak, seemingly so strong, solid, has huge foliage, right? Versus the bamboo that looks so flimsy, sways with the wind. The oak, when a hurricane or typhoon, you don't have typhoon, so hurricane. When a hurricane comes in, that oak, the roots are shallow, that oak is pulled out and is gone. The bamboo weathers every typhoon because it sways enough with the wind and has deep roots. So which one will you be, the oak or the bamboo? It could be both, right? I mean, to some degree, but that's those two things. Vulnerability seems like a weakness, and then the idea of strength between the oak and the bamboo. That's the second. The third, and this book is almost a love letter to journalism, because pretty please, do not confuse influencers with journalists. Our task is not to be popular. In fact, sometimes we write the things that are the most unpopular. They get us in trouble with authorities who wants to stand up to someone very powerful and challenge them? Certainly none of us do, but as a journalist, that's the task, right? So what I worry about oftentimes is that people can't tell the difference between PR, influencers, and journalists. Journalists have this thing called standards and ethics. And we have a mission, right? That's here. Okay, finally, I'm going to leave it with just this one last part. Actually, I can leave it with this. So these are the chapter titles. Chapter 11, Hold the Line. I'm not pro-Duterte, anti-Duterte, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. I'm not any of those things. I'm pro-facts, pro-evidence, right? And I weigh on the side. A good journalist weighs on the side of the evidence. The phrase hold the line is precisely what it says, which is these are the lines of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. And the Philippine Constitution is patterned after the United States. We have 3 branches of government. In fact, the first Constitution of the Philippines was approved by a US president. Hold the line means you know the rights, and regardless, like in our case in the Philippines, it felt like there was a bulldozer trying to push us off. But we held the line, right? We exercised our rights. Don't voluntarily give up your rights. I think that's because the subtitle, What Doesn't Kill You Does Make You Stronger. Nietzsche really was right, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm gonna leave it here now, bring you to the big picture. Why is all of this important, right? First, in the Nobel lecture, I talked about how, yes, there's a conventional war. Russia invaded Ukraine. That's the first time in a very, very long time. But I would wager that you are in a battle. Because if you are on social media, it becomes a person-to-person battle for facts, a battle for integrity, a battle for values, right? So that's one of the first steps, and I'll show you the context of these bigger problems. The second one is, like the Philippines, what we saw was death by 1,000 cuts of our democracy. You know, I used to study the way Al-Qaeda, that virulent ideology, spread globally, hijacked homegrown movements, and then radicalized individuals. Well, this one, what we saw was essentially through social media, geopolitical power was able to go to the molecular levels of our democracies, like you. It has gone to the person-to-person level, right? Imagine that you can actually be targeted. You have been. And so death by 1,000 cuts is death by 1,000 cuts, not just of democracy, not just of our shared reality, but of our values. And I'll explain a little bit later why. Finally, the last big lesson that I would suggest is something I learned when I first migrated to the United States when I was really young. I was 10 years old. When I could barely speak English, we spoke Tagalog in my home in the Philippines. And this was to embrace your fear. Because oftentimes, we stand in our own way, right? So from when I was really young, I always thought, you know, whatever it is you're most afraid of, you reach for it, you hold it, you embrace it, because if you do that, conquer that, then nothing stops you. Embrace your fear. And sorry, that last sentence I wrote because really, journalists can't do this alone. Civil society can't do this alone. We're at the molecular level of our societies, which is person to person. So your courage, truly, at this moment in time, determines our fate. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, this is where I'm looking at my timing now. I want to make sure that I don't go over time, so I want to hear your questions. This is where it all begins, data, right? The difference between an Excel sheet and big data. When it's an Excel sheet, you can look at it like words, right? You can actually, but when it is big data, like this room is not even big data, you know, when it is big data, it's transformative. It changes everything. And I'll show you some examples of what that means. But big data was the major transformation that we lived through, and we didn't really look at it. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. Every time you post on any app on your phone, that app, let's use Facebook since they're my favorite recently. 100% of Filipinos on the internet in the Philippines are on Facebook. 100%. Facebook is our internet. So every time I post on Facebook, Facebook uses machine learning to build a model of me that knows me better than I know myself, right? So that model then becomes Facebook's property because they use machine learning. Now replace the word model with clone. So that's the power of big data. They can take our relationships, everything we post with predictive analytics and machine learning will give them our clone, right? And then what they do with it is they say, I'm going to take your clone, your clone, your clone, and I'm going to put it all together here. Let's go upstream. This is the motherlode database. That is what's used for micro-targeting, right? And micro-targeting, that advertising is very, very different from the advertising, the old media advertising. So that's just one example. In the old days, normal data, you can't clone us. Now that clone is owned by almost every app you have on your phone. here's what happened, right? And how do we fight this? I mean, you have, in 2014, news organizations lost our gatekeeping powers. And when news groups tell you, how do we gain the trust of our audience back? It's not within our control, because distribution is social media, it's technology, right? And the biggest problem is that when you separated content from distribution, news organizations, journalists kept creating content, but the tech companies began to determine what is distributed, right? So what gets distributed? Well, here's the funny thing. By 2018, an MIT study showed that lies spread at least 6 times faster than those really boring facts. Because we journalists spend our careers learning how to tell stories to make you care. We cannot compete against outright lies, especially if they're laced with fear, anger, hate, us against them, right? So this is what flows through the distribution system, what connects each of us. Almost every single social media platform does that, which has turned them into a behavior modification system. Think about it like this. In my case, I was pounded so much. There are 2 ways that your behavior is modified. First, by the crowd, right? Some people won't post anymore because they're afraid the mob will come. If you're, let's say if you're in high school and you're posting and you get the approval of this crowd, a crowd that can turn into a mob like this, right? It makes you cautious. It makes life performative, right? So this is part of the problem for our kids coming up. But for us, the 2 ways that they become behavior modification systems is if you say a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes a fact. You pounded 1,000,000. This was something journalists knew before, but since we were held liable for the facts, you could sue us if we told a lie 1,000,000 times. On social media, with information operations, or in the case of Russia, information warfare, right? This all began around 2014 because that was around the time when the meta-narratives changed, leading to the annexation of Crimea. And those meta-narratives are the same ones used by Putin to invade Ukraine itself 8 years later. All right, so behavior modification system. There's the bandwagon effect, and there's the using speech to pound. And I'll show you that specifically because I lived through it. But how do we fight it? Legal students here, the law students here, well, these 4 things are normally thought of as something separate. America is very late to this, so please push forward on this. Antitrust, number 1. Data privacy. Should they really own our clones? Can they create our clones, right? The basic foundational stuff. User safety. What you're familiar with most often is content moderation, but all 4 of these things, plus more, are connected to this. Human beings have been commodified. The last time we were commodified was the age of industrialization, where labor was the commodity. And you remember we had sweatshops, we had child labor, and the governments, the United States in particular, but governments all around the world created laws that protected labor. Labor created unions. What happens when it's the attention economy? And it is our attention that's manipulated, right? These are the laws that need to be created. In the long term, it's going to be education, medium-term legislation, and finally, in the short term, I'll tell you what we do at the end. This is my story, right? All we did in 2016 was do a weaponization of the internet story. And this series actually proved that 26 fake accounts can influence up to 3 million others. We manually counted it. It took us 3 months to do this, right? That's this story. Fake accounts, manufactured reality on social media. But it was also the first time that we questioned, that anyone questioned the impact of Facebook algorithms and how they impact democracy. After this series was published, I was pummeled with at least 90 hate messages per hour. It was really transformative for me. I'd never lived through anything like it. I was like going through my phone and thinking, did I do something wrong? So I rechecked my data, but it just kept coming. And so at some point, I just started counting the attacks. Here's what happened. Because I was counting the attacks, I realized that only the target gets to see all the attacks, right? So what we did is I looked at it as data, and we began to map the vectors, who was spreading them, and we were able to do a social network analysis of the network that spreads the attacks. This one was the very first wave. There have been at least 10 waves in the Philippines, but it was so systematic that the messages were broken down by demographic. The thinking class, the 1%, this account was in charge of that. The middle class, this account was in charge of that. And then the mass base. This account was in charge, she's an entertainer who later became a public official. This was the same network that attacked the vice president of the Philippines at that time, also a woman. She ran for president last May and lost. But this was the first wave. So you can map the networks, right? You can use natural language processing to look at the way you're being attacked, what is the messaging of the attacks, and then you can map the networks that are attacking you. That's kind of cool. And that actually is what gave me, Diane asked me this, what gave me the courage to keep going. Because those 90 hate messages included things like this, right? Like anything that was perceived as vulnerable, things that can make me vulnerable, the way I look, the way I sound, my sex, anything. I'll show you what happened after that. This one was, you'll notice the photo shows cracks in my face. I have eczema, atopic dermatitis. It's very, very dry skin. So if I don't sleep or if I'm stressed, my skin gets worse. I'm a journalist. I don't sleep and I'm stressed all the time, right? So yeah. But when I first started getting attacked, I was still sensitive, So when things like this started happening, it has a visceral impact first. But then it got worse because it walked into dehumanization. And this is something that, sorry, I hope you're not eating or drinking. I laugh about it now, but it's because this was 2017. So it's been a while. I've learned to accept it and actually to tell you, I have eczema, right? So what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But what this does, they started making nicknames, scrotum face. This was all over Facebook and Twitter for months. And then when they finally started taking it down, they had code words, SF, scrotum face, right? And it was like, I hate to say it's like Notre Dame versus Boston. It was like a gladiator's battle to the death. Not like a sports match, although sometimes sports matches. And it was, it brought out the worst in people. They did things like this, the PBS film, 1,000 Cuts, but look what they added, right? It's still there. It still pops up every now and then, but please, if you see it, report it. But why should it take your time, right? what has happened with social media is because they want to keep you scrolling, your fear, your anger, your hate, you stay on longer if your emotions are triggered. And when that happens, the platforms make more money. That's the surveillance capitalism model. All right, let's get out of that. Last year, 2021, 2 years ago, UNESCO did this study, and I was the first big data case study. It's still the worst attack on a women journalist. But what they found, this is with the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO, is that women suffer a lot of attacks online. And it's not just journalists, but politicians, researchers, women in general. Somehow, all of this kind of, the name and shame tactics of the past don't work anymore, right? 73% experienced online abuse, 25% received threats of physical violence, and of that, 20% were attacked in the real world. No journalist should have to deal with that, right? I mean, but it is what it is. The big data case study showed that 60% of the attacks against me were meant to tear down my credibility. 40% were meant to tear down my spirit. Yeah, it didn't work, but it certainly took time, money, energy, and still Nietzsche's quote holds, right? So let me bring it macro to you and why your personal battle counts. This is a map that was done, a timeline done by the Election Integrity Partnership with this Stop the Steal, right? With the election, the big lie, the election conspiracy. Take a look at when it was first seeded, because this is the same methodology, whether it is attack against me or an attack against American democracy. For me, it was say a lie a million times. The attack was journalist equals criminal. Maria Ressa is a criminal. They did that for a year. And then a year later, President Duterte said it in his State of the Nation address. Look at you here, August 2019, an op-ed on RT, Russia Today, right? That's when it was first introduced as a narrative, this kind of election fraud, and that there was going to be cheating, and so many believed it. But here's where it began. And then by August 2020, so a year later, it was picked up, Darren Beatty, on Steve Bannon, right? This is YouTube. And then it was picked up by Fox. This is already September 15th. The mainstreaming happened 2020. And then, of course, it came to QAnon on October 7th. And then President Trump came top down in November, right? Bottom up, top down. In Tagalog, we would call it a bibingka. A bibingka is, Anton is laughing. Now, the fire is coming from the bottom and the top. So that's how information operations work. Don't call it misinformation. This is disinformation. A Russian KGB chairman, a former Russian KGB chair, Yuri Andropov said, "Disinformatia is like cocaine. You take it once or twice, you're okay. But if you take it all the time, you become a changed person." All of us on social media have become changed people because lies spread faster than facts, right? Think about it like Netflix Stranger Things. We went into the upside down. If lies are rewarded, what world are we creating? It's like you told your kid, "Hey, come here, lie, I'm gonna reward you. Keep lying, I'm gonna keep rewarding you." That's the incentive structure of our information ecosystem today. We're upside down. Is it a surprise that the cascading failures happen? I'm not gonna leave you depressed, I promise. Let me finish the thing with, what time should I end? 30 minutes. I wanted to keep this to 30. These are the two big things to look at before I tell you some of the solutions that we went into, right? social media has become a place for information warfare. And we know this, 124 million Americans were targeted in the 2016 elections. It happens almost every day today, that it has become a behavior modification system. I know this firsthand in what happened in the Philippines, but it impacts us on 3 layers. And we only talk about misinformation like, we're like a game of telephone. That's not it. The first impact is on the personal, each one of us, how it changes. You come through our emotions to change our worldview, right? And because you change your worldview, you change the way you act in the real world. Think about it like this. If you don't have integrity of facts, how do you have integrity of elections? The second level is sociological. As a group, we behave differently in groups than we do as individuals. Groups do bad things that a normal individual won't. That's how mobs are formed. In my book, I talk about the mobs I lived through in Indonesia. And good people are parts of mobs, but the mobs destroy, right? So that's the second layer, sociological. There have been all these psychological studies that go back to Milgram, that go back to the conformity studies. You can look at it. We behave differently in groups. And then finally, the very last one is actually, I think, evolutionary, because this stuff actually is addictive. It has, we each, when you're on your platform, you have increased levels of dopamine, which causes mild addiction, right? It's what happens when you're addicted to gambling in a casino. It's designed to keep you addicted. Great book, Dopamine Nation, which actually focuses largely on the United States and addiction. Well, at an evolutionary level, the emergent behavior that is encouraged, that is rewarded, is the worst of us. It is the fear, it is anger, it is hate. It's part of the reason you have a far-right network, like tentacles globally that connect. And I can show you this in maps, right? It triggers fear of losing from young white men are targeted, right? So these are all things that are there in the data. We can talk about that more. Where has it brought us? I keep saying we're in the last 2 minutes in the game of democracy. Sorry, it's not football, it's basketball. But the last 2 minutes, we're in the last 2 minutes because between now, 2023, right, and 2024, there are almost 90 elections all around the world. If you don't have integrity of facts, you don't have integrity of elections. If this information operations are operating in my country, they're operating in yours. They're operating where social media works, right? And now that you're on TikTok, that's even, I think of Facebook as a blunt mallet, TikTok as a surgical probe. The more your choice is taken away from you, right? It's just a stream, the less agency you have. So this is the problem. By 2024, we will hit a tipping point. If you looked at VDEM, they said 72% of the world today is under authoritarian rule. We have now rolled democracy back to 1986 levels. And in Asia Pacific, it's 1978 levels. That's not a coincidence. And what we're seeing is this geopolitical shift. Anne Applebaum calls it autocracy because Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won again in the last elections. I call it kleptocracy. But they're not connected. Sorry, let me make sure. We can talk about that more. So this one, that we're shifting to fascism. These are the biggest trend, right? This is why you must win, why we need to win this battle for facts. So how do we rebuild? How do we come together? It's really simple. These are the Venn diagrams of Rappler, which we formulated in 2011. Technology, journalism, and community, right? And in each one of those circles, smack in the middle is Rappler, but that's also where journalism belongs now. Tech, journalism, community. In tech, Rappler is building its own tech. Journalists, folks in the journalism program, you gotta get tech. We cannot hold tech accountable if we don't understand it, and not enough of us do. The second thing that I've done in the last 2 years is to push for legislation. Remember, short, medium term, it's legislation. And the EU rolled out the Democracy Action Plan, which has the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. That's already kicked in and kicks in full this month. On journalism, I co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media. It's a global fund to try to help journalism survive, because those same tech companies that are using micro-targeting have killed the business model of news. So even as you need mission-driven journalists, those news organizations have been gutted. And that's what you need to fight. So in the interim period, while we put laws in place, like a Better Business Bureau for your hearts and mind, laws in place for the tech companies, we need to help independent media survive. I co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media with the former president of the New York Times, Mark Thompson. And we just raised last year $50 million. And a week ago, I was in Paris, and we were sorting out how we were going to move this forward. That's from democratic governments, right? The last one is community. That's you. That's why I'm here. Because, you know, Diane has to keep me out of prison so that I can keep doing this, right? But community is you turning from a user to a citizen, right? Getting back your rights. Stop going with the flow. Stop using that without realizing how much it is determining what you do and what you think, actually how you feel. We're coming up on the tail end. This is the last thing I want to show you, which is what we did in the Philippines that's a hard one, May 2022 elections. Because we saw, all of our surveys told us that Marcos would win. He was ahead in the statistical surveys, but we decided that it's not political. I don't care whether you vote for Trump or not, but I do care that you have the facts. So this is a battle for facts. And this is the Facts First PH, hashtag FFPH pyramid. It's a whole of society approach to protect the facts, right? While we're waiting for legislation, we need to come together. And this is what we did in the Philippines. It was the first time that it's happened. We had 16 news organizations coming together for the first time. Never done it before, because we all compete against each other. And we decided we would come out with fact checks. Those boring fact checks you don't read, right? But then look at the second layer. This second layer, the mesh, was critical because these groups, 116, they're civil society, NGOs, human rights groups, business groups, the church, their task every day was to share those boring fact checks, but to add emotion. And they couldn't use anger. You know what we discovered? Inspiration spreads as fast as anger. And we took over the center of the Facebook information ecosystem. So that was a good lesson from there. The third layer was research, academic institutions. There were 6 of them. There were 8 universities and research groups. We had data coming in from the news organizations, which we shared across the board. Those 8 groups did every week leading up to our elections a webinar that talked about disinformation and showed you who was being attacked, what were the meta-narratives, how were we being manipulated. And the last one, the accountability layer, finally the lawyers jumped in, right? 6 legal organizations from the Philippines, and you know what? They were the most enthusiastic. They filed more than 20 cases in less than 3 months to protect the rest of the pyramid. And, you know, they were so enthusiastic, and those journalists at the bottom of the pyramid were so exhausted. You cannot have rule of law if you don't have facts. We have to fix the information ecosystem. Let me leave it there because I would love to hear what you think. Thank you. Where do you want me to go, Diane? Oh, Diane's been introduced, right? Where do I go? This is the woman who kept me out of jail for 7 years, right?
Maria, thank you so much for talking to Notre Dame, and most especially talking to our students about the ongoing war that they don't realize they're a part of right now. So I want to jump straight into what is something that I find in my own teaching recurs with many students who often say, I'm just one person. These issues are so overwhelming. You talked about the molecular person-to-person problems. You also talked about the macrocosmic problem, and it's wonderful that you talked about the facts and that pyramid and how to do it. If we were to try and mobilize a whole of society approach, how can this audience right here, Notre Dame students who want to make a difference right now, how could they get involved?
I think you move into the real world and become citizens protecting the facts. You will come out with your own pyramid, right? But you need to use tech. I think what helped us was we had a data layer coming through. It doesn't matter which way you vote, right? But I think it's critically important that we protect the facts. And to know when we're being manipulated. So in your area of influence, the reason why I talked about the honor code is it's your area of influence. In your area of influence, come together with other people, organize. I can't believe a journalist is saying organize, but that's what we have to do. We literally, I don't think we would have survived if we didn't. And despite this, you know, that 4-layer pyramid, our facts first PH pyramid, it was actually funded by Google News Initiative. Thank you, Google. But if we didn't, even though we did that, we still had a Marcos win. But that's okay. Our facts were protected. And by that point, here's your other danger. People's cognitive biases will shift them. They may not want to listen. But you are students who, and professors, right, in your area of influence. If you go back to facts, then we can begin to have a shared space. Organize, I guess, is the short answer.
Okay. That's one thing we try to teach here at Notre Dame at the Keough School of Global Affairs, as well as the rest of the units of the university in our human rights program. But let me go a little bit to the harms that you shockingly talked about, because there's a prevalent discourse right now. As has been pointed out, 72% of the world is now authoritarian. The difference is the authoritarians also like to speak the language of human rights. So early on, you had critics saying, well, Ressa is walking around. She seems to be free. Doesn't seem to be any harm against her. What's the harm in just a bunch of messages from a bunch of anonymous people? Why should this concern us if any other of our neighbors is receiving this kind of graphic, abusive language on an hourly basis?
I want her to file cases. No. I mean, part of it is, I think, that's a little bit of a gaslighting, right? These are the things the tools that are used against you. The most corrupt points the finger at the least corrupt. You're doing what I'm doing, right? It's part of the reason it's harder to hold power to account. I think the second thing is you need to realize that the autocrats aren't staying at home, right? That not only do they cave the institutions of democracy from within, but they begin to ally, and they are actually, in terms of trading partners, they're almost equal to the democratic countries. So that the old checks and balances in terms of economics is all swiftly going away. But to answer your question, Diane, I just don't listen to gaslighting. That's gaslighting. It's a potent tool. Imagine if someone it's political harassment and intimidation. And by targeting you, like, does that make you crazy that I'm pointing at you, right? Like, that's actually what the president of my country did to me. I woke up one morning and he just targeted me in a nationwide address. I'm a citizen, I'm one journalist, and he was lying. So I said he was lying, but that's all you can do. It's not his fault. Here's the thing. Autocratic countries are exploiting what were once advertising marketing platforms. This is as much the platform's fault and also an abdication of democratic governments that allow this to happen. That's why legislation needs to kick in. Also something that you can push for, right?
Excellent. There's an interesting trope going around that says, actually, if you take a look at the latest report from the Committee to Protect Journalists, the number of killings of journalists have decreased in the last 5 years. What they will not tell you, however, is that the number of unsolved murders of journalists around the world have basically increased to about 86%, which tells you that if journalists are murdered, most likely the murder will not be resolved. It also doesn't tell, at least that statistic is also often omitted along with the fact that the highest number of arrests have been committed against journalists. And the third thing they don't say is what precisely happened to you and to Rappler. They not only attack the credibility of the journalist, they destroy the infrastructure under which the journalist operates. So how can Rappler, at this point, having faced so many cases, how can it still struggle to survive in this ecosystem? I know you said there's a global fund for public interest media, but for something as innovative as Rappler, which basically pioneered journalism, digital journalism in the Philippines and elsewhere, how can it survive in this ecosystem?
With great difficulty, but okay, let me put it this way. The impact on us was first in terms of arrests. I mean, who wants to get arrested 10 times, right? Arrest warrants, there's kept coming. They hung a Damocles sword. We could get shut down any day, even though we've done nothing wrong. In terms of what we're doing, that quote by Nietzsche, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," we realized early on, so the first shutdown order from our SEC came in January 2018. Within 4 months, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. I'm in charge of that, right? So what did we do? We pivoted, and we were able to, by the end, Q3 2018, find an alternative, sustainable business model. And it uses tech and data, right? What we did is we essentially are able to map out for you what's happening in the virtual world, because there's no virtual map. So it forced us to find something that stood with us when the pandemic happened. So as news organizations were laying off people, we were hiring people. That won't last, because this is quicksand. We're living in quicksand right now. And to you who are, I hope, journalism students, good job, man. You got courage. This is the right time. Even though it sounds really bad, this is the time to come in, because we're literally going to create what the future is going to become. And that's my response. I think that we've already proven you can stand up. How to stand up to a dictator? You do it by telling people, by being transparent, by demanding accountability. The dictator in the book goes beyond Rodrigo Duterte. It is Mark Zuckerberg. Who's the bigger dictator?
I think the other thing as well that probably not a whole lot of people know is that part of the challenges of trying to continue to run this operation while constantly being in fear for your life, with many death threats, with many grave threats to your person, to that of your family, to all the risk that you take to tell the truth at this point. It must be extremely hard that in today's, you said earlier today that, influencers are not the same as journalists. How do we tell the public how to discern? How to discern between what is verified, what is worthy, what is actually worthy of our attention, as opposed to the cacophony of constant attention-getting clickbait that we see paraded online. Because it is true, it is a battle of standards, but how do we fight for standards now?
The tech companies will always say they mirror humanity, right? That's actually not true because, for example, this is an easy one. In the case of the recommendation clustering algorithm, in Brazil, this was a YouTube research that was done several years ago. In Brazil, they took the far-right fringe supporters of Bolsonaro, and the clustering algorithm put them together with every conspiracy theorist and grew that to buoy Bolsonaro all the way to the presidency, all the way to January 8th, right? I guess I'm saying that we need to be aware of how we are being manipulated, that these algorithms are far more insidious. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about it as an atom bomb that exploded in our information ecosystem. If you cannot trust your information, you cannot move, you cannot organize, you cannot act together. You asked every single person, should it be your task? It's become that way by default. And what I worry about is it's killed trust, right? George Shultz actually was saying this, like he said that, with the best thing he's ever learned is that with trust in the room, anything is possible. Without trust, nothing is possible. So for me, the very first thing we need to look at is legislation. We have to demand that there be building codes. We know this building is not going to fall down on us because there were building codes. We know that drugs, for example, that are tested, have been tested, are not going to kill us if we take it. Or that, if you think about it, your toaster has more regulations on it than the tech that manipulates your heart and mind. This is the problem now. So that's the first. And then the second one is, in the meantime, because there's always an in the meantime, please come together, organize, look at, we're building a generation now. Gen Z is fascinating. They're more progressive than the generation above them, but they're also closer to family, or at least we are in the Philippines. Right? But also more skeptical of everything. I don't know what that breakdown of trust means, because in the Nobel lecture I said, in order to be the good, which is I think where you are, you have to believe that there is good in the world. And with an incentive structure that rewards the bad, it's very hard to see good on social media. So, that's not really a quick answer for your question. It's a complex time.
But in the spirit of thinking about Gen Z, we have a number of Notre Dame students who are going to pose questions to Maria, who actually have been pre-selected by virtue of the excellence and quality of their questions. May I therefore invite, first and foremost, Mr. Carlo Amorado. Please introduce yourself.
All right, thank you for that talk. That was amazing. I'm Carlo. I'm a junior here at Notre Dame. I'm a student worker for the Liu Institute, and I'm also the co-president of the Filipino American student organization here. And my question is, you just touched on it a bit, but if you could elaborate again. As civilians, how could we help journalists in holding the line for freedom and truth in this day and age regarding social media?
Thank you, Carlo. So I think it's the best way is to begin to move into the real world and organize, become a citizen, right? I said this before. In the 4-layer pyramid, civil society was the distribution arm of that entire pyramid. But I think more than that, think about the Nobel Prize, right? The Norwegian Nobel Committee gave the Nobel Peace Prize to journalists in 2021. In 2022, they gave it to civil society. Three groups in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Civil society needs to step in because news organizations are so weak. And here's the other part. What's happened is that distribution system of social media has actually commodified the news to the point that the news that gets distributed the most is actually not great journalism, right? It's clickbait at the beginning is what we were talking about, but then beyond that, if it inflames emotions, it gets wider distribution. This is not the incentive for investigative journalists. So realize that you're not going to get your news on social media. Go to the websites of the news sites, because every news group is there. But I guess those are the two reasons. You know, you're going to need facts, and the second, you're going to need to organize.
Thank you very much, Carlo. For our next question, we have Ishika Sharan.
Ishika, that's right. Hi. I'm a master's in global affairs student doing the governance and policy track. And I come from India, and I've spent some time studying disinformation in India itself. And my question is around using legislation as a solution. The danger with that, what we're seeing in India, is that the government often uses the same legislation to crack down on very legitimate dissent. How do we protect ourselves against that?
Right now, the Indian government is doing a heck of a lot more. I mean, I was at the East-West Center. I gave the keynote last June or July. And the Indian journalists were the ones who were most afraid of all of the ones. Part of it is because Prime Minister of India, Modi, I covered him in 2004 in Gujarat. Like Marcos, he couldn't come to the United States because he had human rights. He was accused of human rights violations. And once you're democratically elected in a nation, all of that goes away. So Prime Minister Modi, he became a prime minister in 2014, right? And has been in power since then. The BJP has a troll army. I mean, it's huge. So look, I think, let me separate them. The first question is actually, frankly, for Western democracies, as in America itself, right? Which these are American companies, the first three. TikTok is not, but ByteDance, which runs TikTok, is an American company. The first step is, why are we not protected? Why is there not a better business bureau for our hearts and mind? And that's for these companies. I went through a lot of this really fast. If you're interested, please, I'm on Twitter, you can DM me. But two groups abdicated responsibility for protecting the public sphere. The first were the tech companies. The second were the governments that should be protecting citizens. Could these laws be weaponized? They already are. That's not going to stop it. So the fear of having another law weaponized, I mean, I just don't see any other solution. Imagine if we then devolved the responsibility for cleaning up the poison that they've thrown into the information ecosystem to every one of us, right? Right now it's content moderation, which is where most of the debate happens. Think about the information ecosystem as a river, right? And what they've done is, because there's a $70 million tech lobby in 2021 here in the US, what they said is, oh, we're going to make our content moderation better. So they take water from that polluted river. They clean up the water, they drop the thing, clean it up, and then they throw it back in the river. It's polluted again. So that's a whack-a-mole game. But you have to go all the way up to that factory of lies, all of our clones that are used to micro-target, and prevent that from pushing out the lies. Then we can begin to rehabilitate the river. It will take time afterwards, like the drug addict, but it's necessary.
Thank you very much. For our third student question, we have Jandro Alcantara.
Good afternoon again, and thank you again for meeting us.
I picked you out. No, I mean, I was like, you, go out.
So yeah, my name is Jandro Alcantara.
Jandro.
I was born and raised in the Philippines and went to the International School of Manila. Currently a senior, majoring in economics and film, theater, and television with a minor in Asian studies. So my question to you is, obviously you mentioned that the Philippine government is ripe with controversy and essentially corruption. From the Duterte to now the Marcos regime, what are expectations for yourself and as a macroeconomic view, Rappler, in terms of the regulation of media?
Oh, wow. So first, we have, for those who may not know, 37 years ago, People Power ousted Ferdinand Marcos, the father of our present president. And then 36 years later, last year, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected overwhelmingly to the presidency, partly because of information operations that began in 2014 that changed what Marcos meant, right? That name Marcos changed it from a kleptocrat to the best leader that the Philippines has ever had, along with other meta-narratives that were seeded there. So the first, I think, is, in terms of regulation or in terms of what to expect from the Marcos administration, let me be very fair, which is we had come from such a low that it's actually improved slightly. It's still early in the game. We now have a president who cares what the rest of the world thinks, who has traveled more in his first 100 days in office than any other Philippine president we've ever had, and who has visited both the UN and the EU in Geneva in the last year, in his first 6 months. Let's see where it goes, but so far, last month, I had 4 tax evasion criminal charges that could have sent me to jail for 34 years. I was acquitted along with Rappler, which means the independence of the judiciary may be coming back. My lawyer can tell you more. But I guess in terms of media freedom, I'm breathing a little easier. And that's all I can tell you. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but we'll continue pushing forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jandro. We have Cecilia Ignacio.
Hi, thank you for coming. So I'm Cecilia. I'm a junior from the Philippines.
Wow, you're all Filipinos.
I'm a Rappler intern, and I am.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I am studying economics and English here at Notre Dame. And my question is, how has the transformation from an ad-reliant model into a new business approach impacted or influenced Rappler's mission to fight fake news and promote tech innovation, especially with the rise of AI and chatbots today?
Thank you. Let me take the tail end first, which is, how many of you guys have tried the chatbot, the OpenAI, the GPT chatbot? Have you tried it? Oh, not enough yet. Really interesting. You should. I'll tweet the link. You can try it. It hallucinates. Like, that's their description, right? So in terms of Rappler, OpenAI, the chat GPT comes from GPT-3. GPT-3 uses large language models to basically, respond back. But you can also use it to write stories. And so in our May elections in 2022 last year, we had 18,000 simultaneous elections, and we in Rappler wanted to make sure that we had biographies of every single candidate. Rappler's only 100 people, we only have 10 reporters. So what we did is we fed data, we structured the data, and GPT-3 came out, and actually by structuring the data, it came out with biographies for all of the candidates. So you can see on Rappler, right, it says this profile was brought to you with OpenAI, GPT-3, and checked by Rappler Research, because it hallucinates. So here's where, so what we tried to do was, we're building tech on Rappler. It's tech that should have been finished in 2017 if we hadn't been attacked. But the money I was using to build tech went to legal fees, except Diane. She is broke right now. I have some great pro bono lawyers. But it took the money that we were going to use to build tech, and to build a decent tech platform. In the US in particular, you can't build one for less than $3 million, right? The entire seed fund of Rappler, when I started it, was $2 million. So now we're finishing a new platform called Lighthouse, where we literally turned my elevator pitch from 2011, from 2011, because I was raising money then for our 2012 launch of the website. Our elevator pitch then was, we build communities of action, and the food we feed our communities is journalism. What's the tech backbone of building communities of action? That's what you'll see in Lighthouse. Having said that, I'll go back to close on the chat bot. GPT-4 was just released last week. And GPT-4, so GPT-3 thinks like a human being, right? This is what makes this interesting, because it goes word for word. So Maria says, so our mind goes through it quickly, but for every word that follows, there are 1.7 billion iterations that the machine does, right? And in that iteration, it then finds things. The chatbot is fed data. And this AI is only as good as the data you feed it. My worry is garbage in is garbage out. It's been fed the data, the unstructured data of social media, which rewards lies over facts, right? So they themselves have written, it hallucinates. That word is there. So be careful. And I think this means that it will get worse before it gets better.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. I think we have Sarah Bender up next. Oh, that's our intervention from the director of the Liu Institute. We regrettably do not have enough time. I think we could have this discussion and have this as a series of lectures, frankly. But please join me in a warm round of applause to thank our speaker, Ressa. And I very much hope that Thank you very much, Notre Dame. When I took Maria's case, I told her this is what we do, and this is exactly why we are here today.
Before we go, I got to tell you what happened, right? She was my Hail Mary pass, right? So what happened was she had 1 week to do the filing at the Supreme Court, and she stayed up 3 nights. Oh, am I supposed to talk about this? I can, right? Because this is not the case itself, but she stayed up 3 nights to come out with 80 pages. That was perfect for the filing at the Supreme Court. So thank you, Notre Dame.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Liu Institute and Notre Dame International, thank you for attending the Asia Leadership Forum. Please have a wonderful evening.